As one might expect, the conclusions of archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein arouse fierce controversy, even within the archaeological profession.
If the Rahov dates are correct.
Here, Professor Finkelstein is in Los Angeles, taking part in a heated debate.
All kinds of retelling and editorializing and writing.
A major issue currently dividing archaeologists is the Old Testament portrayal of what happened after the conquest.
Don't talk, it's my turn. And we have a...
The Bible says that once the Israelites had established themselves in Canaan, a great empire eventually arose over all their people. This unified empire was supposedly established in the 10th century BC by David, he of David and Goliath fame. His capital was at Jerusalem, which is why it's known as Royal David's City. And after King David's death, he was apparently succeeded by his son, Solomon. The heroic biblical portrayal of this dynasty has always made it seem a kind of golden age for the Israelites. For once, as far as David is concerned, we can actually say with confidence whether he was real or not. A stele is a stone tablet bearing an inscription. In 1993, archaeologists excavating here at Tel Dan, a northern outpost of the Israelite kingdom, found a fragment of a foreign Aramaic stele from the 9th century BC, which refers to King David by name.
When you look at what is written there, in the 9th row, 1, 2, 4, 6 of the letters make up the name which can be read Bet David. It's the first time that the name of Bet David, or David, as the father of the kingdom of Judah, is mentioned in a source which is extra-biblical, not something that was written by the Bible author, but something from the 9th century BC. And it's the first time that the name David is mentioned. It's unique, and it tells you that it could be that David was an historical figure, or at least people in the 9th century thought of him as their founder of their kingdom.
So it seems David was a real person. The Bible says that his capital was Jerusalem. It mentions large armies and important public buildings. But Professor Finkelstein is skeptical of this portrayal, because present-day archaeology doesn't support any idea of Jerusalem being a big city at that time. Ronnie Reich is currently excavating the site of 10th century BC Jerusalem.
A pocket here, a pocket there, maybe in other places which Canyon has found. But for this particular period is not yet enough to say even, I think, the nature of the site. Is it a huge urban city? It is definitely not.
In the ancient part of Jerusalem, there's a curious stepped structure. Some archaeologists think this might have been part of David's fortifications.
In my view, David's Jerusalem was a kind of a citadel city. It doesn't mean that he had a huge city around him. The city was quite small, but he probably gained a lot of political power and somehow succeeded to control the entire country in a time when there was a gap, there was a kind of a vacuum, political vacuum in this country. There was no Egyptian empire anymore. The Canaanites were very poor, and probably he took advantage of this situation.
But even this modest view of Jerusalem is hard to reconcile with the archaeology. Ronnie Reich and Professor Finkelstein are descending into the bowels of the city. It seems Jerusalem at the time of King David was only sparsely inhabited.
So much has been excavated here in the area, and nothing has been found, no stones, large stones of, let's say, 10th century, no pottery. Pottery which is found everywhere, and if people were active in this place, they might have left something behind, must have left something behind, so that here the negative results again and again and again simply prove the point.
The idea of a great Davidic or Solomonic Empire in the 10th century BC is absolutely ridiculous. Because an empire needs a capital. There's almost nothing in Jerusalem, a very small village. An empire needs manpower. There's nothing in Judah, a few small villages. An empire needs administration. There's no administration, there's no scribal activity. Where is the empire?
Many archaeologists remain unpersuaded by Professor Fenkelstein. They point to David's son, Solomon. He is famous in the Bible for his wisdom and judgment, and for having been the builder of the first great Israelite cities.
And this is the reason of the levy which King Solomon raised, for to build the house of the Lord, and his own house, and the wall of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, and Megiddo, and Gezer.
The Bible mentions Hatzor as one of the cities Solomon built. The Canaanite city was indeed rebuilt in the 10th century BC, and Professor Ben-Tor can see no reason to doubt that it was Solomon's work.
How can we be sure, and I'm talking only about Hatzor now, how can we be sure that this fortification, that this gate were built by Solomon? We cannot be sure. There is no building inscription said, I, Solomon, built this building. But what we can be sure of, and we checked it again and again and again, by means of stratigraphy, by means of pottery typology, we can be sure that these were built in the 10th century. And since the Bible tells us that it was Solomon, now you don't have to ask me, how can I tell that it was Solomon? It's common sense. If you want to say it is not Solomon, it's you. You tell me why it is not Solomon.
Traditional archaeology also supported the idea of Solomon as a great builder, because at the two other sites mentioned in the Old Testament, Gezer and Megiddo, they found characteristic six-chambered gates, just as at Hatzor. This was taken as evidence of a common Solomonic origin.
What you're seeing now is the famous six rooms gate at, here in Gezer, the so-called Solomonic gate. It's hard to see because of all the vegetation and everything, but you can still see the main pass in the middle, and then 1, 2, 3 rooms to one side, and 1, 2, 3 rooms to the other side. You still see the beautifully worked stones at the entrance. There is a similar gate in Hatzor, and there is a similar gate in Megiddo. And these three gates were thought to be, because of the passage in the Book of Kings, these three gates were thought to be the gates that Solomon built, the blueprint of the Solomonic architecture. It doesn't fit because there are gates like that also in other sites, which are not Solomonic in any way. Ashdod, it's a Philistine city. Tel Batash, it's on the border between Philistine and Israel. There's a later gate in Lachish. So it's like, let's say, it's more like a fashion of the Iron Age gates than something that single out Solomonic building.
This is the similar monumental six-chambered gate in Megiddo, found in the 1930s and also assumed to be Solomonic. On the basis of the archaeology, we can tell that the Israelite palace which stood here was quite an elaborate and sophisticated building. Now, modern radiocarbon dating tests are being conducted to try and establish the exact date of the palace. The results of the tests are not conclusive, but they point strongly to a date about a century after Solomon.
This is the new data together with the old data. And the one thing you can see is that the new data is consistent with the previous one. So we didn't change the picture, and that's great, because you don't want each time a new data comes, the picture to be changed completely. And moreover, it supports the picture, because this red point, which is the new one you just brought here, is nicely consistent with the low chronology and fairly far away from the high chronology. So objectively, that's what we expect. So
Great.
I think it's fine.
The low chronology, pointing well after the 10th century BC, makes Professor Fenkelstein and Neil Silberman doubt whether a great empire could have existed at that time.
Look, it was a wonderful story. It got people excited and really interested in the Bible, but we just can't accept the story of the Solomon's Gates anymore.
For many reasons. First of all, right there from the beginning there was a problem, because when you look at the report, at the archaeological facts on the ground, the gate is definitely later. It must be put somewhere in the 8th century or something like that. But beyond that, today we know that there are gates like this all over, later than the 10th century, in the 8th century, and even in the 7th century, and beyond the borders of biblical Israel.
But some archaeologists think there may well be something in the biblical account. This is Thebes in Egypt. The great temple of Karnak records the history of the pharaohs and of the great Egyptian dynasties. One of these inscriptions refers to the military exploits of a pharaoh called Sheshonq I. It details the blistering devastation that he visited on 150 towns and villages in Canaan in the 10th century, the supposed Solomonic era. Uniquely for an Egyptian campaign in Canaan, Sheshonq's forces turned inland from the coast and attacked towards the highlands where Jerusalem is situated.
We have to ask ourselves what is the reason for such a pharaoh in the 10th century BC to invade the central mountains, the hills, which were forested and were hard terrain to reach for a military campaign, Egyptian military campaign. I think that this is a good hint that there was some political entity in this region. And this political entity, in my view, can be identified with this united monarchy, which probably threatened the Egyptians, or they saw in it some kind of threat, political threat or economic threat.
So the evidence, archaeological and textual, provides a very contradictory picture of 10th century Canaan. There may have been some kind of Israelite entity, but it seems highly improbable that it could have been the elaborate empire portrayed in the Bible.
It's confusing. The highlands of the south are very sparsely settled. There's no manpower for great Davidic conquests. In Jerusalem, it's a small village, nothing monumental, no real evidence for big capital.
Despite the biblical evidence.
Of course, no evidence for a great Solomonic capital ruling over a great state, rich state, and so on. And here at Megiddo, the buildings, the monumental buildings which had been described as the symbol of Solomonic greatness, in fact, date a bit later. They don't date to the time of Solomon, they don't date to the 10th century. So we are in a situation of a complete negative picture, negative evidence from coast to coast.
So what had been connected with Solomon and used as an illustration of his greatness is later, and we have to rethink the whole situation.
Yeah, we do.